Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Jerry Ortner, anthropologist, a professor at UCLA, and the rest you'll hear in the course of this podcast.
Indeed. Sherry, it's wonderful to see you. It's always lovely to see you. I'm realizing we first met probably getting on for 30 years ago in New York, and then got to know one another better, I guess, when we were both living in LA. But I've not seen you for a long time, though, of course, I follow with great interest your career. And so it's lovely to be with you today, albeit with some construction work going on above me, which I hope isn't too annoying. So to begin things, I just wanted to ask you what's currently preoccupying, dynamizing, interesting you, what's holding you back, what's pushing you forward, what's going on?
Okay, well, thank you. It's an interesting way to open things up. I think the first thing is the state of the world is in general, and the US in particular at this moment is just kind of terrifying and disturbing and very, very worrisome. And so reading the papers in the morning and so on, it's a trial. I mean, I do
Yeah.
worry a lot. But I will talk about my work a little bit so that in terms of what I'm working on right now, and we can come back to that if you want to later. But I have two projects underway. I'm working on a photo memoir because I've been taking pictures all my life, and this is not kind of artistic photography. It's just candid photography for early on. It was my family, and then it was high school and college, and then throughout my whole career. So I actually have a huge kind of archive of pictures of many anthropologists, among other things. So this is all going into a memoir that is mainly concerned with my life as an anthropologist, not so much my personal life, or
Mhm.
although there is a kind of background chapter about my my family background and stuff. And the other project is a follow-up to something that we might talk about later. I had done this project in the 90s about my high school graduating class. I graduated from a high school in Newark, New Jersey. And at that time, their children were in their early 20s. And I interviewed a lot of the children as well as the parents. The parents were the primary focus, but I also collected a lot of interviews of their children and never wrote it up. And so now I'm actually following up on the children of my classmates and to see who are now themselves um, the age that my classmates were when I did the
Mhm.
other project.
Mhm.
And the children are now in high school or early college. And so I'm trying to see what happens next. And so that's the other project.
Now, there's an essay you wrote getting on for 20 years ago, perhaps, maybe less, where you said something like anthropology is not your grandparents' anthropology or not our grandparents' anthropology, right?
Yeah.
You've done some of that, as it were, going to other lands, but
Yeah.
you've also done a lot of this also, your work's always self-reflexive, but this account of what's going on around you in the past and in the present, whether it's your book, I think it's called 1958, the year of the graduation from high school.
It's called New Jersey Dreaming. That's the main title.
Oh,
And then the subtitle is Capital Culture and the Class of 58.
I think I remember the 58 bit because that's the year I was born. So I was
Oh,
just,
well, okay.
I'm afraid I was being a little solipsistic.
I don't know. That's very cool. Okay.
Uh, but also, you've written about Hollywood, not Hollywood, I should say, and about life in California. So there's something interesting there for me about your view of anthropology being in part about history, in part about theory, and in part about here, in inverted commas, as well as there. Is that right to say?
I think, yes, I would say that that captures a lot. I mean, the history is important to me, the theory is important to me, and the ethnography of here, even if it's far away, but it has to be kind of part of the present in some sense and part of the issues that are animating people in the present.
Yeah, and you get that with your project about the children of your classmates. Um, when you look at the photo memoir, when you're putting that together, do you have a sense of massive change over your life, or do you have a sense of continuity, or a bit of both?
So that's a good question. I think the continuity is that I have, and as I kind of talk about in the memoir, I think really I have been an ethnographer and in a sense an anthropologist since like fifth grade or something. I mean, kind of very deeply, that's the continuity. And that it's a deep part of who I am and just as a person. Um, but the way the memoir works is I feel looking back, well, I guess I felt at the time too, that there have been kind of really radical steps forward, like from where I started out, that particularly in terms of, well, both in terms of theory, anthropology, and theory and practice in anthropology, the
Mm,
field is really different from where I started, um, but also in terms of the political uh, shifting of well, first of all, the shifting of anthropology toward a more political perspective in general, and then specific political breaks and moves forward, first feminism, and then uh, uh, kind of the civil rights movement and
mm,
the move toward a much more strong concern with race and ethnicity and things like that. And then finally, a kind of, I think the next big one, and perhaps the last big one, was kind of the impact of neoliberalism on the field and in my thinking. So it's been a series of, on the one hand, a lot, there is a kind of underlying continuity. On the other hand, a kind of series of big, in my mind, big steps
yeah.
and going forward. Yeah.
Now, I wonder if I could, as they say in baseball commentary, take us back
Yeah.
to an essay you wrote that had a big influence on me and on probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of others. I'm sure you know the one I mean. It's about the one that's positing, is nature to woman as
Yeah.
culture is to man, although I end up getting them all conflated. So you were actually really a pioneering figure in terms of feminist anthropology. And that gender question that you posed all those years ago, it's still pretty alive today, isn't it?
I would say so. It has, I didn't actually, the degree to which that article, and I laughed because nobody gets the title right. It wasn't everybody, or they might get it right, but they kind of stumble over the female is male to culture, and I mean it's
Mhm.
not the title that rolls off your tongue. But I that was my second publication of my entire career, by the way. I mean, the feminist movement, women's liberation, as we called it at the time,
Mm.
really was breaking just as I was finishing my PhD. So my earliest, I wrote uh, one article, very kind of conventional article about my Sherpa data, my ethnographic material. And then, but my my first job, little junior, assistant professor person just out of the PhD, was at a small liberal arts college called Sarah Lawrence College. And at Sarah Lawrence, I got swept into co-teaching a course because the women's movement was just breaking at that point, and I got swept into teaching a co-teaching a course on, I forget what it was called. I think it was called Women, Myth, and Reality. And with a uh, an American historian, a European historian, and an English literature person, and me, the anthropologist. And we just kind of invented this course. Some of my co-teachers had actually been writing about women, but I hadn't. And I said, I don't know, if I can do this because I don't know anything and I don't have any primary material either. I hadn't looked into it with my Sherpa research, and I said, but okay, we got to do something. This is really important, and we have to get on this. And so I wrote that as a lecture in the course, and then I published it. And I mean, I was just kind of, I don't know, inventing stuff on the fly because I really didn't know where any of this was going. And the degree to which that article became a kind of, I don't know what, I saw kind of um, shockingly widely read
Mm.
art piece, has been a surprise. Although the degree to which it's widely read or the reasons for which it's widely read have changed over time. I think in some ways it was at the beginning it was thought to like help people think about you know any the inequality of gender. But then very quickly there was a lot of kind of backlash against it. And then now it's sort of coming back again as a kind of, well, let's take another look at that article because it seems to still be useful in some way. So it's over 50 years old. I mean, and it's had this amazingly long history, and it's still like alive in some surprising way.
It's regularly anthologized and it's been translated into Greek, Japanese, Portuguese, Spanish, you name it, right?
Yeah, 10 languages.
10
Yeah,
languages.
yeah, yeah,
And there was something there that was very important, that remains important for a lot of readers, I think. It was certainly important for me in terms of a lot of those struggles over rationality, over reason, over the disembodied mind, all those sorts of questions that were brought up so powerfully in a number of contexts, but I think very successfully there. Now, you mentioned the Sherpas, and that's a theme that's been relevant to you over a very long period. And this, in a sense, is slightly more traditional anthropology than some of your
yeah,
work, which
yeah,
is you went to the global south, you lived with people, you observed their lives and
right.
and learnt their language. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that and about how that feels as though it's changed over time.
Right. Well, in I the first I first went. This was my PhD research, so I was a little graduate student doing what I was supposed to do, and I went off. It was very remote. The area was. I was very proud of myself, and one at one level that it was a 10-day trek in the Himalayas. And I was a little girl from Newark, New Jersey. I hadn't done a whole lot of hard trekking and in my life. And anyway, yeah. So the first project, which was my dissertation research, was about was fairly conventional, I would say. Although of course, I tried to do something a little bit, always a little bit different, but it was about hospitality and kind of social relations, culture, religion, those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, things were changing. I think I was changing and the field was changing, and things were moving in a number of different directions away from this more conventional type of ethnography. And one of the ways in which it was changing was uh, the field was changing, but I was also hanging out with different friends intellectually, different colleagues, and so on. So, one of the big ways for me was history and the feeling that you really, and I still, I'm still kind of promoting this whenever I can to poor graduate students who are just barely getting on top of their anthropology. And I'm saying, yes, but you also have to do this historically. Um, it was part of a theoretical shift to thinking about how, not only about history in the sense of the past, but just history as what makes people into who they are today and what people in turn make of their lives going forward. So it's the idea is just that it just not so much history as the past, although the past is terribly important, but the idea of a kind of like moving ethnography kind of moving through time. So it's always, you can't, ethnography is like a moment, and that you have to think of it as something that was made. What you're seeing now was made in the past, and what you're seeing now is going to make a future. And it's all about that process rather than history with a kind of capital H.
That's a wonderful explanation, incredibly helpful, I think. And you talk about the field changing and you're changing. Anthropology has come under very serious criticism in the last 40 years, perhaps, for all sorts of reasons. But one of the things that many of its critics miss out on is that a lot of its criticism came from within.
Yes.
Huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I said, what I'll say about that. I sort of have, in terms of my own work, I have, when I first started out, as really with my very earliest articles, I would start out with how everybody was all wrong. Here now, what I'm doing is here's how we have to look at it, really, and start out with a critique. I mean, the first line or the first paragraph would be a critique of others. And my advisor, Clifford Gerritz, looked at one of these early articles and he crossed that out. He said, don't start out with what other people are doing. He said, start out with what you have to say. And that was wonderful advice. And I took that and I give it to my students. Don't start out like it's not it's not productive. It's not in a way, I don't know, it just uh I'm not sure how I want to say this, but it's not a good way to begin to present your own ideas as a critique of everybody else.
It can
Or
be rather lacking in charity, I think. It's an uncharitable way of operating. And it can also mean people get much too caught up in what X or Y said. And
exactly,
X and Y are just another tenured professor who speaks English.
exactly, and then you get caught up in debates that are not particularly interesting very often either. Now, what you're talking about is a broader critique of the field uh, I mean, I think particularly they've come in stages. So there was the writing culture moment in the 80s where they published a collection. George Marcus and Jim Clifford published this collection called Writing Culture. And it was this really kind of sweeping critique of the field, or so it seemed. And and I think all of us like kind of sat up and thought, okay, what am I doing? I mean, is it me? Who are they talking about? Because I was not part of the original group, so it must have, I was on the outside. Um, so there was that moment, which had much more, looking back, was more traditional than it appeared and less radical in a way than it appeared. It was kind of like urging people to be a little better and more actively, um, how can I say, sort of be, well, I don't want to put it this way, but I guess I will because I can't think of the word otherwise. More, there's this kind of push toward even a further textualization of culture. But we were already doing textual interpretation of culture. I was trained by Clifford Garrett's. That's what we were doing. But this was kind of pushing it more radically ahead. At the
Mhm.
time, it looked like, as I say, looked very radical. I think later it didn't seem so much because the next big break and the next big critique was the post-colonial critique of anthropology, and that was very powerful, and I think still reverberates today. And I think that had a huge impact on the field. Um, but it didn't. I didn't get that involved in it in my own work because by that time I was shifting toward U.S. based ethnography. So I didn't get involved in the debates over the colonialism and post-colonial, and anthropology is kind of a handmaiden of colonialism. I just kind of tracked it. It was very important. It changed, there's no question that changed the field. I think that anthropology could never be the same in terms of so blithely going, sallying forth like the great white, person into some other culture and so forth. So, yeah,
In terms of your Sherpa's work, which has been has come out in at least a couple of books and quite
three,
a lot of articles, three, and
yeah.
also been translated. How did that change over time in terms of the way you were seeing the world, in terms of the status of anthropology and so on?
So, so the first book, which was called Sherpas Through Their Rituals, was a very textual, cultural interpretation of, I mean, an interpretation of Sherpa culture based on the interpretation of their ritual lives and their social life as ritual, also social life as ritual. So again, very conventional in the sense of being fixed in time. It was just like um, there was, here's the Sherpas, here's what they do, here's their culture. I don't think it was terrible, but I think looking back, it was still part of an earlier moment
Mhm.
and things were changing. So the second one, which was called High Religion, was a history of Sherpa religion that basically said what I did before. I didn't look at what I was seeing before in my fieldwork as an outcome of a history. And so it was a kind of, I had to rethink my field notes really. And I already had some of this in the notes. I had these observations, but I wasn't paying any attention because I didn't have this framework.
Mm.
So, so the second book was a history of Sherpa religion and also shifting more toward a political economy perspective on that history, different modes of forms of inequality, forms of economic, um, I don't want to say exploitation, but I don't know, what do you do when someone gets stuck in these things, Toby, in this,
Well,
can't
the
think of
point
a word.
is, I throw you a lifeline. But the point is, I guess, this is an interesting maneuver because without dumping textual analysis, you're reconsidering the production of your texts from a political economic perspective.
Right.
That's not very Goethean, I don't think.
No, no. So that was one of those moments of breaking away from the way I was trained, and uh, but I never gave it up, by the way. I never gave up the interpretive perspective. I mean, I just enlarged it and historicized it and so forth. But I mean, how can you give up the asking about meaning? You know, basically, you have to ask what things mean to people. Otherwise, you're just imposing your own interpretations on their culture. So if you, so one more book. The third book, and this is the one that got translated and has had more kind of a life outside of anthropology, was called Life and Death on Mount Everest. And it was a history of the Sherpa involvement in Himalayan mountaineering from the turn of the 20th century, from the beginning to the turn of the 21st. And everybody knew the Sherpas carried the loads of the white guys up the mountains, but there was no study of the Sherpas themselves, of like what they thought they were doing, what was motivating them, what was pushing them, what was pulling them, and also how they saw themselves in the context of what they thought, that the whole thing was crazy for a long time. I mean, it was a way of making money for them,
Yeah,
and that remained the primary motive. Like whatever the Westerners thought, they thought the Sherpas loved them. They thought the Sherpas loved what they were doing. The Sherpas are out there making money because that's it, even though it's very dangerous, that's the best way to make a living in their context. So, so the book actually has been quite successful because it's been read by mountain climbers as well as anthropologists. And I do get I was nominated for some, outdoor sport prize and things like that. So that was a different universe from my usual audience.
absolutely. And again, translated into many languages. So that is an extraordinary change. Are there people over that history of the three books that you still know about, but you knew when you first did your field work, or their children or whatever?
Absolutely. So the last time I went back was in the 90s. I haven't, because I started the American work in the early 90s, and I went back also in the kind of early 90s, I think, too, to just get a few more, get some more material to finish the Life and Death on Mount Everest while I was starting this new project. And so I haven't maintained contact in with the Sherpa community in Nepal particularly. Although I have some, now that there's Facebook and all these things, there's a lot more possibility of staying connected to people. But the more kind of exciting and interesting thing is that there's now a huge Sherpa community in uh, in New York City. And so when I was at Columbia, I mean, I was on the subway with Sherpa friends in Queens. They mostly live in an area of Queens outside of New York City, called Jackson Heights. And Jackson Heights is famous as one of the most ethnically diverse places in the world. And there's a big Sherpa community there, and they have New Year's celebration. I mean, they have a whole social and cultural world there now. And so, yeah, so I've stayed in touch with many friends and families that I knew from before. Yeah.
Lovely. So in this shift towards, in inverted commas, becoming an Americanist, the first big, I guess, substantial product of this is New Jersey Dreaming, the
Yeah.
book that I narcissistically retitled 1958.
Yeah.
Now, it's a wonderful book. It's a fabulous project. Can you tell us a bit about it? And can you give a bit of context to people who may not know much about Jersey and being a Jersey girl?
Okay. So it wasn't actually what I set out to do, and I will forecast the fact that what I originally thought I wanted to do was a study of Hollywood, and then for various reasons, I wound up doing this study of my high school graduating class. I don't want to go into a long shaggy dog story about how it happened, but I did. And so the Hollywood thing went on the back burner, but that's kind of the preamble to turning to film issues later on because I really had been interested in that from the beginning and then it got set aside. So, um, okay, so the high school study, two things, people who might not be familiar with with the sort of American scene in this respect, two things. One is New Jersey is a state with a funny kind of reputation. It's kind of working class. I mean, it has all different communities, but the image or the take on New Jersey in popular imagination is that it's kind of working class, it's kind of low class and a little bit dirty, full of refineries as you drive up the New Jersey Turnpike and so forth. So it has a funny reputation, and it's as like a joke place to come from. And so Bruce Springsteen, for example, is from New Jersey, right? And he sings, and he did the song Jersey Girl, and so that's how people know about it. And so it has its kind of defenders, including me. And not at the time, I must say. I couldn't wait to get out of there when I was growing up. But now I look back at it with great fondness and, kind of sense of belonging. Uh, and that's one thing people might not be aware about. The other thing is the public high school. The American public high school is an institution which is now kind of dying out in a way, but or has changed dramatically for it's a complicated history. But at the time, most people, when I was growing up, most people did go to public high schools and all people across all classes and races. And so when it became a possibility for me to do that project, I had not thought of it myself. Some people suggested it, and but once it was suggested, because of those two things I just said, it did become kind of appealing that I would, and I thought it would be interesting, but I also thought it would be very stressful since I thought high school is tough. I mean, I think even public high school, private, whatever, I think everybody knows like whatever they did in that stage of their life, it was not fun in many ways. And so I wasn't sure how I would feel about going back there and studying those people and that history and all of that. But I went to a reunion and I had a good time. And I had not gone to any reunions before. I was not like one of the people who are, deeply tied in their memory to high school years. I was really kind of somewhere else by the time I started that project. And but two things happened. The reunion um, I was, first of all, I said I had a good time, surprisingly to myself. Well, I just thought I would be, I was extremely nervous
Yeah,
beforehand.
I'll bet.
And,
Yeah.
um, but I saw people that I liked and had been friendly with, and I thought, oh,
Okay.
this is not so bad. And, but the other thing was people wanted to talk. Like, and the anthropology antennae went up, right? Because people, I thought it would be hard, but not it just it was just the opposite. People loved to talk about it and to talk
Mhm.
about their lives
Mhm.
at the time and since that time. And it just kind of started to, even at the reunion, I was like, oh, this would be doable, and so that's the kind of backstory for that.
I have a grown-up daughter and a 10-year-old daughter, and my 10-year-old daughter is fascinated by, you know, women or girls from sort of 12 or 13 to 21 and the becoming of into being a woman. So I've now watched all high school movies and TV series
Yeah,
in the United States, which really are redolent with this suffering and this horror that you mentioned.
yeah, yeah,
But inevitably, eventually you take off your glasses and you become a swan that all the boys love, or whatever it is. You know what I mean?
yeah,
There is
yeah.
this
Oh, yeah,
narrative. But it's interesting because, pardon me, there is also this sense of the worst slash best years of your lives.
yeah.
Perhaps that's what's impelling storytelling. Were, the king and queen of the prom kind of unhappy and multiply divorced or dead when you went to the reunion? Or were all the old notions of beauty and football still applying?
So, so this was the first one I went to, the one that triggered the project.
Yeah,
Was the 30th reunion. So people were in their 50s by that time,
right.
and 50-ish. And I think there was both, just as you say, both things were going on. People who had a terrible time in high school, in a way, always want to talk about that. And the people who did well did okay. He did have okay afterwards, but it was always a fascinating question. Whatever happened to so and so, right? There was like, whatever happened to the captain of the football team or the head twirler or the whatever, and a certain amount of um, I don't know, still a kind of reversion to high school feelings about all of that. There's a people, kind of, and even people talking about. Um, I remember I wrote this in my field notes at the time that somebody said I was talking to somebody beforehand from the class, and we were talking about who it was known who was coming and who was not coming to the reunion. I guess was on the reunion committee, so she knew who was going to be there and who wasn't. And somebody else said, uh, "So are any of the popular girls going to be there?" And so I thought, "Oh my God, we're back in high school. Popular girls are they going to be there?" Or so it kind of throws you back to some extent into that mindset. And on the interview, I have to say the interviews were amazing. I mean, as anthropology and as a person and as somebody who was part of that world, the, people just opened up, and it was just spectacularly interesting to listen to people. I just couldn't, after a while, I just couldn't wait to do the next interview. It was so interesting. Yeah.
And the result is a prize-winning book, we should say.
No, that one never won a prize.
Well, didn't it? Let me just check my notes. New
The life.
Jersey Education Association Award for
Oh, oh, right. Oh, right. Well, I think that was like there was extremely kind of minor prize,
Excellence.
and then when I said I couldn't be there to receive it, they withdrew the prize because they it was part of the deal that they wanted you to show up and and make there was going to be a celebration and so forth. And so I think they withdrew it. I think I never actually I was informed that I had been awarded the prize, but I think in the end I never got the prize.
That's a great
So
high school story. We're giving you a prize. Oh no, we're not. So there then continues as you move to Los Angeles, an interest in the United States. But meanwhile, you publish a book which I must admit I haven't read, but which I actually have a Spanish edition of, which is called Anthropology and Social Theory, Culture, Power, and the Acting Subject. Is can, as I say, I must admit I haven't read it. My apologies, but could you tell us a bit about that one? What is the acting subject?
so yeah, so this it's that's a collection of essays, some of which were published earlier, and then some of which were written specifically for the collection. And this was part of going back earlier in this conversation. This was part of my really early move out of my earlier training with Clifford Geertz and with kind of standard anthropology, which is I had moved into not just history, but as I kind of described my sense of history earlier, but to a world of theory that was is identified with Pierre Bourdieu and other Marshall Solins in anthropology,
Hmm.
Anthony Giddens in British sociology. That's been called practice theory, and it's a theoretical shift which um, really I described earlier without using the terms, but it is basically about how people are made by the past that they come from and how people in turn make a future, although they don't necessarily know what they're doing or how how the future that they're making. So once you get into this framework, which is really the idea of people, uh, history makes people, but people make history. That's the kind of that's the whole thing in a nutshell. Once you get into that, though, then you get into questions of uh, the ways in which people are involved in making history, mostly not consciously, mostly not intentionally. They're not out there like remaking that. Well, sometimes if you're involved in social movements, you are involved in remaking the world, but most people in their everyday lives, they don't think they're making a new world. But the point of this whole framework is that that people's everyday lives can also be the source of social change and transformation. So let's see, where was the question?
What the book's about, and specifically the
Right.
action, the acting subject, because I had to.
Acting subject, right. So some of the debates around this body of theory have to do with things like what is the subjectivity of people
Mm.
in what they're doing, how they're reacting to the world, how they're trying to shape their lives moving forward. So subjectivity is one area, and I have an essay about that in the book. Another one is intentionality. Do people mean to do what they're doing, or
Mm. Mhm.
does it how does it happen in spite of what people intend or because of what people intend? So there's an essay about intentionality and what we call agency also in the book. So there's several essays, and those are the new essays in that collection that attempt to kind of push this idea forward about how people make history without necessarily being involved in some kind of history making intention. But
Beautiful. And then we come up to the present with the two latest books of yours that I know, which are about film.
right,
Tell us about those. Tell us about Hollywood, not Hollywood, as it were.
right. So So the I so I told you earlier that I really thought I was going to do it. What I when I began to think about what I was going to do in terms of my American anthropology of the U.S. The question was what, and my original interest was Hollywood, and I was interested in because I was interested in what's the sort of machinery that makes what we think of as like mainstream or hegemonic or dominant American culture. That was
Mm,
the question.
mhm,
And of course, Hollywood is, that's it. Hollywood is one of the massive sites of the production of hegemonic, maybe not so much anymore, but for most of the 20th century, it was true. And so that's what I wanted to look at. And I and then I set it all aside and then came back. But then when I moved to Los Angeles, I thought, okay, either I'm going to do this Hollywood thing or not, because the time has come. And so I set out to see if I could get access to Hollywood studios and Hollywood, the actual sites of production of sort of mainstream movies.
mm, mhm,
And I I spent an entire year. I had not a lot, but I had many people with connections in Hollywood studios who I was asking to help me out because you can't just march in. They're very heavily kind of fortified almost in both like physically and socially. And I just got nowhere. I could not crack the Hollywood studios. I couldn't get in to do ethnography. And that's what I wanted to do. And I was like extremely frustrated after a
mm,
while. I did think if you knew enough people and you found, you had enough connections, and it just didn't occur to me how heavily sort of blockaded the whole Hollywood system is. But in the course of that year, the first year I was here trying to um, crack the studios, I was meeting all these people in independent film, and they're saying, "Oh, you don't want to do Hollywood. Hollywood is, Hollywood. Anyway, you're not going to get in," which was true. Uh, and I would say, "Okay, really? Then what are you suggesting?" And they'd say, "Well, we do these independent films, and maybe you'd be interested in that." And I met more and more people in the world of independent film, and I began to get more and more interested in that as basically the anti-Hollywood. And so that's what I did. That was how the project just evolved. And then I gave up at some point. I stopped trying with Hollywood. I just threw myself 100% into the independent film world, and it was much more. It was very accessible because they are. I don't know, it's not a big machine like Hollywood. It's a kind of very open sort of network of people, and you can just show up and start asking questions, and that's what I did.
In the subtitle, you refer to the twilight of the American dream. Tell us a bit about that.
Okay. Well, so when I started the project, I was already this goes back to the mixing of theory and ethnography. I
Mhm.
had already become interested in uh, the impact of neoliberalism in general on American culture, American young people, especially Generation X, which I also, in fact, wrote about. I wrote an article about Generation X as children of neoliberalism, basically. And they have the Generation X have pretty dark worldview, pretty dark expectations about the future, which surprised me and shocked me because they were the children of my generation, which is, like the 50s, optimism, everything's going to work out. And then I started watching independent films. I mean, and not just talking ethnographically with
Mm.
people who were involved in the it's not an industry, the world of independent film, and but started watching massive numbers of these films, and they were also extremely dark. I mean, in fact, it's like the kind of signature of independent film is that they make you miserable. They're depressing. It's intentional. It's quite intentional. Which I learned in the course of the project, and I began to put two and two together. And I felt that the independent film world was tracking the same thing as Generation X, and it was all the impact of neoliberalism and the end of the American dream. So let me stop that phone if it's gonna. Um, okay, yeah. So yeah, I think I stopped there.
That's a wonderful, wonderful account. Now, Prof. Sherry, I've just got one more question for you. And then I wanted to invite you, as a means of bringing things to a conclusion, to add anything you might wish. And that could take the form of going back over something we've discussed, or it might be something entirely new. Does that sound all right?
Of course,
So, my last question is about screening social justice, which is, in a sense, I guess, the slightly more upbeat, rah-rah civil society, social movement activism side to independent cinema. The idea that by telling the truth to power, or at least sharing that truth with ordinary people, one can make a difference. And this is the other side to the darkness of a view of US life. This is the side that is endlessly get up and go, where
yeah,
there's hope through activism. Is that fair to
right.
say?
I think that's a good summary. It I I wrote in the beginning of that. I'm trying to I can't remember the chronology exactly, but I wrote that I was either in the first Trump regime or had just finished it or was just starting. I can't remember where it came in there, but I was actually very upset about Trump that time around. And so I wrote at the beginning of Screening Social Justice that I was fighting myself from being too gloomy and
Mm.
being too pessimistic, and that I had to look at what they were doing, and I wanted to look at what they were doing
Yeah.
at this company, Brave New Films, um, as having some kind of possibility of fixing things, of changing things, of making it better. So I tried really hard to make that book more optimistic. It actually took work in a way because I think I wasn't entirely convinced that, about what can work anymore in terms of I hate to end again and even this interview on such a gloomy kind of note, but so that's why it has that quality. It's sort of more uh, an act of faith or act of hope or whatever about something like that. Yeah.
I appreciate your frankness. So here's your last opportunity to get the drum majorettes out and going, Sherry. Is there something else you'd like to sign off with?
So I don't think, I mean, I mentioned the new projects that I'm
Yeah.
working on at the very beginning, and I have to say I'm having a pretty good time working on the memoir. It's fun. So I do that to keep kind of the darkness at bay a little bit. And the children of the class of 58, I don't know how that's going to turn out, but at the moment, I don't, I have to really kind of see where it's going to go because what I had hoped to see, the question I was hoping to ask was, because they were so gloomy about their futures in the 90s. And my question was, in a sense, like, okay, how did things work out, for you, in fact, after all? And what I'm seeing, it's just kind of the early days of that. But what I'm seeing is I'm only hearing from the people whose lives worked out well. And so it's it's hard. It's not clear what I'm going to be able to say about that
You
later.
can't just write about the daughters of the popular girls.
No, exactly. Exactly. Right. Yeah. So
Well,
I
listen,
think that's it.
that's exciting. I think both the photo memoir and the children of the class of 58, really great things to be doing. And thank you so much for all you've contributed and are contributing to our world of knowledge, and especially for this conversation today. It's been lovely seeing you.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me.